Parkinson Society Central in Northern Ontario, where I'm the Education Program Development Coordinator. And I have the pleasure of introducing this afternoon's presentation, and we're all here to see Tanya Benard, and the topic is the Alexander Technique. And a few words briefly off my cheat notes about Tanya. She's a certified teacher and member of the Canadian Society of Teachers of the Alexander Technique. Currently maintains a private practice here in Toronto and also teaches the technique at the Royal Conservatory Music, as well as at the Trinity Valley, a beautiful studio overlooking the Niagara Escarpment in the Milton and Burlington area. In 2009 and 10, she is also a guest faculty member at the Glen Gould School, delivering an ongoing Alexander Technique program that she developed. And she's here to enlighten us about that today. And without further ado, I guess I'll let her
I first started working in the Parkinson's community about 4 years ago. A woman who recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's contacted me because she read some research on how the Alexander Technique can help in managing the symptoms. And I wasn't familiar with the research, but when I read it, I thought, oh, this was very interesting. And her main concern at that point, she was starting to have tremor. And she, in her own words, she didn't want to come out as a Parkinson's sufferer in her social circle. She didn't want it to become the focus of all her lunch dates with her friends, but yet her hand was being forced literally in that direction because the tremor was particularly bad when she was eating and in social situations. So we started working together, and within a few months in the lessons, we were able to get the tremor to stop, like when it would start by using the process that we were working with, we were able to get it to stop. So that was really exciting. And then the more we worked and the more she worked with it outside of the lessons, the more she was able to reproduce that effect on her own. And another interesting benefit, if you read the article I wrote in Livewire, which is again also in the packet, I do talk about this as well, but in there. But the other interesting benefit that she had when she went to her annual physical that year, her doctor said, I don't know what you've been doing, but women in their 70s are not supposed to get an inch taller, and certainly not women in Parkinson's. And so she attributed that also to the work that we've been doing, because sleeping was another one of the symptoms that was very common for her. So inspired by that success story and all of the success stories and the research, I mean, again, success in terms of managing symptoms and giving people tools and strategies, I started reaching out more to the Parkinson's community, and I've since worked myself with a much wider range of cases. So I'm hoping to tell you a few stories about that. I'm hoping to tell you a little bit about the research. It's difficult for me to give you a sense of how the technique helps with Parkinson's without explaining a little bit more about what it is, though. So I'm going to try and start there, build in a few opportunities for you to observe yourself in relation to some of the principles or ideas that we're working with. And then in the second half, and unfortunately this is what got a bit shortchanged this morning, but in the second half I'd like to ask for a couple of volunteers from the audience to do a bit of a demonstration of the hands-on work so you can see the process in action. And you know, it's an interesting thing because without the demonstration, without the explanation, the demonstration can seem a bit like magic, and it's really not magic. It's something you can learn to do on your own. So that's why I want to start by explaining a little bit about it. But the demonstration can be really useful in terms of seeing what the process is actually like. So before we go any further, I'm just going to ask you to take a moment to stop and just notice how you're sitting. So I'm not watching, you don't need to do anything to improve it just yet, but just take a moment to stop and just notice. Notice your whole body sitting in the chair. Notice your feet and legs. Notice your hips. Notice your rib cage, your shoulders, your arms. Notice your neck and head, and then just notice your breathing. Good. So we seldom take the time just to stop and notice how life is affecting us. And it's amazing how difficult it is sometimes just to stay with noticing. Usually our attempts to notice something are very quickly steamrolled by our attempts. That's mine. Our attempts to improve it or figure out how we're supposed to do it and how to make it better, even with something as simple as sitting in a chair. And it's interesting. I'd say that's something that's generally true. And then with the added layer of Parkinson's, then often we'll things often go one of two directions, or maybe in both directions. Sometimes we go more in the direction of trying to control the body or hold it so that it's in some kind of better position, so depending on what your symptoms are, so that they're not as present or as noticeable. And then sometimes when we're struggling with our bodies, it leads more to a tendency to disconnect from our physical selves. So Alexander, the man who started this Alexander technique over 100 years ago, he was trying to solve a very specific problem in himself. The more he understood about that problem and, you know, trying to work his way toward a viable solution, the more he realized that the most important first step was first to take a step back and try to connect to the big picture of what was happening without trying to, you know, change anything right away, or, you know, force a change or impose a change. And these are all ideas that you'll keep hearing coming back in different ways. But I often think the best place to start is by asking, why do we need the Alexander technique, or do we even need it? And I'm going to start from a very general place, because everything that's just plain old human about you, predating the Parkinson's, for those of you who are Parkinson's sufferers, it is also equally relevant to working with what your symptoms are through the Alexander technique. So on the most basic, general level, most of us accumulate a lot of patterns of tension and strain. So without realizing it, we often use more effort than we need, even in the most basic activities, picking up a cup of coffee or a bag of groceries. We're often busy, stressed. Eventually we get tired, and we have more of a tendency to slouch. Again, what we don't always realize is how that impacts not just on the way we look, but eventually on the shape of our bodies, and certainly on the amount of energy and vitality we have to bring to whatever it is that we do. And, you know, all of those things are not specific to Parkinson's, but they put a lot of wear and tear on the nervous system. Then when we add Parkinson's over top of that, there's even more wear and tear on the nervous system, as well as some other symptoms that are specific to the disease. Now, the really remarkable thing about all of these tendencies, and some people might identify more with a tendency toward overdoing, some people might identify more with a tendency toward collapse. And again, that's generally true, and with Parkinson's too, you do see sometimes more stiffening and sometimes more soothing. Whatever our particular pattern of tendencies is, chances are that it's crept in so gradually over such a long period of time that we're not likely, it basically feels normal to us. We're not likely to notice it until it becomes so pronounced as to interfere with our daily activities or to cause us discomfort or pain. So a practical example is probably useful. So say, for example, I'm not going to sit down because I'm not really able to see you, but imagine that I'm sitting at my computer, and maybe I'm getting kind of a sore back or sore arms, or maybe my hands are tremoring a bit, or maybe I'm getting headaches. Anyway, somehow I become aware of my body, and it occurs to me that maybe I'm not sitting in the best possible way. And so often when we notice things like that, it occurs to us, well, maybe my posture has something to do with this. And the Alexander technique is often connected to posture. So what do I know about posture? Usually I think, my grandmother told me, I should sit up straight and put my shoulders back. So what do you think? Did I improve my posture? Not so much. Anybody have any advice? Relax. Does that matter?
Straighten your legs.
Straighten my legs. Gradually do something with the top back. So we could do this for a while, and it can be fun actually, but the main point being that we often try to compensate for doing too much of one thing by doing too much of something else, again, without going to that step that Alexander came to realize was important, of taking a step back and trying to connect to the big picture. And this is often a useful illustration also, I think. So you can see, can everybody more or less see? So you see he's reasonably upright and buoyant, as most of us are when we come into the world. And then life happens to us, and we start to become a little bit, some interference comes in. And again, this happens to all kinds of people, and then with Parkinson's, that's another layer. So the question becomes, how do we get from here, right, back to something closer to this? And the reason I think this is an interesting illustration is that so often when we find ourselves here, we think, what can I do to make a change, right? And yet you see this is the uninterfered with state. So to get from here to here, which is where we began, it's actually more a matter of taking things away or weeding the garden rather than adding something. So yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there. So it can be useful sometimes, and I'm just going to speed through this, but sometimes to get a sense of, rather than just having me demonstrate. So the interesting thing about this picture, so we often think of people often think of the Alexander technique in connection with posture. And in fact, I've never not seen someone's posture improve as a result of studying the Alexander technique, but it's kind of amusing to me because really the Alexander technique is kind of like anti-posture. Because often when we go, at least in the conventional sense, because often when we think of posture, we go to the I swallowed a broomstick place, and it doesn't help us so much, right? It gets stiff, it doesn't really let our movement be free, and so on. So, this is interesting to me, this picture, I always think, this person is not in the I swallowed a broomstick place, right? Poise is a nice word to describe it. And if you notice how long the back is there, and I'm just going to speed through. So this picture is interesting to me because even though this is probably a fairly heavy thing for this little person to be carrying, you see the whole body is supporting the hands and arms, and there's not a whole lot of strain in this area. If you saw an adult doing this, you'd probably see a lot more tensing up or bracing in that upper back. This is a really interesting contrast, I think. You see the less interference, more buoyancy here, and then you see the stresses of life are really starting to be felt. I'm going to keep, maybe I will linger here. So again, in both of these cases, these little people are achieving a goal, whether it's picking something up or writing. But you see this little person is able to maintain that buoyancy or that expanding flow of impulses in the body. And then here, maybe he has great penmanship, but at some cost to himself, right? And we're often not given a lot, we come into the world with pretty good use of ourselves, but we're not given a lot of tools or encouragement in terms of how to maintain that. And it's not even always seen as very important. There's a million variations on how these patterns of excess tension and strain can manifest, but I'm going to hone in on this one especially, which I'll come back to later. You can sort of notice. So, I swallowed a broomstick. Often, some people might start here and then try to, stress builds up, then they try to relax and they end up here. Some people start here and they try to improve their posture and they end up there, right? And often we're flip-flopping back and forth between the two. And again, these are basic things, but they tend to be even more exaggerated with Parkinson's. The caption on this picture was, relaxing is too often merely collapsing. So, food for thought. And, actually, this one I thought of in connection with Parkinson's because so often fine motor skills are kind of a problem. And you see, he's got a nice sense of upper expansion through his whole body. You see how free the hands and arms are. So, and then, again, this is just from a voice book, but often when we go to communicate or when Parkinson's symptoms get worse, there is more of that pulling forward in the body. Skip over that. Often when we think of posture, we think of length, and it's easy to forget that, actually, when we see someone with excellent